Story 1. This happened to me a few years ago, and I just remembered it recently. I was working at a restaurant waiting tables in a very affluent area on the Jersey Shore. We had our fair share of entitled people who were under the impression that if you throw enough money around, you can do whatever you want and treat people however you want. And when your income depends on their tips, you kind of just have to deal with it. The restaurant had an outdoor dining and bar area that overlooked the ocean with an amazing view. During the summer, this was pretty much where everyone wanted to sit rather than our indoor dining area. And for anyone who works someplace with outdoor dining, you know the one monkey wrench that can ruin a very profitable dinner shift: the weather. No matter how accurate the forecast says it's going to be, you can never know for sure. For the most part, we never had an issue, because if it started to abruptly rain, there would usually be more than enough room inside for all the people who were sitting outside to move it. It's usually a mess to keep track of which table moved where, but we always handled it without any issue. Until that one day. We had a large party booked one day in our indoor area that took up more than half our tables. A 50th birthday, I believe, so our indoor capacity was limited. And even on top of the party, there were customers who were weary about the weather, so they decided to sit inside also. And then more and more people started sitting outside. My manager did a quick assessment and realized that if it started raining, we would barely have enough room inside to accommodate everyone who was sitting outside. He told us we had to stop seating people in the outdoor area and to start recommending the outdoor tables to move inside because of the impending weather, to be on the safe side. Everyone's weather app was saying there was a downpour coming up the coast. Everyone was okay with it, except I had a table of 9 people who seemed fairly middle-aged and very wealthy. Each end of the table seemed to be in their own conversation, not paying attention to the other. Upon hearing about the incoming rain, I go to the woman whom I thought was in charge. She had the fakest tan of them all, and I tell her, let's call her Karen, "Ma'am, I'm really sorry, but because of the weather coming in and our limited seating inside, I'm going to have to move you inside so you don't get caught in the rain." This Karen is so entrenched in her conversation, she doesn't even register that I, a lowly waiter, was talking to her. So I tried again. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for interrupting, but..." She cuts me off, exasperated. What are you saying?" I begin again. "Ma'am, I'm sorry because of the weather coming and our inside filling up. We need to move you inside. We have a table ready for you. I can move all your drinks and everything for you." She snaps back with, "The only reason we came here was to sit outside. We'll deal with the weather." I realize she doesn't grasp what I'm saying, so I try again. "Ma'am, just in case the..." And then she goes from 0 to 100 and yells, "I said we'll deal with it." She yelled so loudly that the people on the other half of her table heard. They didn't hear our prior exchange, but only heard her outburst and went back to their conversation, assuming this must be normal behavior for her. She wants to deal with it on her own? You got it. So I began to take their order. Filet mignons, a few lobster tails, expensive stuff. I put the order in and I looked back, and all the other tables had moved inside because they all were rational human beings, and my table of 9 entitled jerks were the only ones out there. I heard the leathery-looking Karen say to the rest of the table, "Wow, we have the entire patio to ourselves. What luxury." After a while I looked inside and saw that the table I had held for them was taken by another party that had just walked in the last available table, and just as the last person hit the seat, I felt the best feeling I possibly could have felt at that moment. A glorious raindrop tapped on the top of my head. Within seconds it went from beautiful blue skies to torrential downpour. Everyone at the table grabbed their drinks a little watered down at this point and ran inside. After they shook themselves dry, they looked around and realized there was nowhere for them to sit. Most of them looked dumbfounded, like a lost child in a supermarket. Karen makes a beeline to me and screams, "We need a table." I replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am, we're fully seated and waiting for our indoor seating. Maybe one table on the waiting list, but a list is a list. Well, what are we supposed to do now?" She hawked back at me, which led to me so eloquently saying, "Ma'am, as you said, you will deal with it." I air quoted it to really emphasize that this was her response, and as I said that, everyone else at the table realized that was our interaction earlier and Karen had dug their graves. I felt bad for most of them because if they had all known the circumstances, they probably would have convinced Karen to move in. But after she raised her voice and cursed at me, all bets were off. And as serendipity would have it, at that moment their food came out and we handed it to them. There they were. 9 people in damp clothes holding a Cosmo in one hand and filet mignon in another, with nowhere to sit to eat. The rest of her party convinced her just to get some boxes for their food and pay their check and leave. As I hand Karen the check, she smugly says, "Well, this will be reflected in your tip," to which I replied, "Ma'am, we implement a 20% tip on parties of 8 or more. It's our policy, and it's clearly stated in our menu." She paid, and then they left with their boxed-up food. Best $60 I ever made. Story 2. It all began when I embarked on a mission to find a replacement phone through Montreal's classified section of Kijiji. My goal was to snag a brand new Samsung S5, and after some searching, I stumbled upon a reasonably priced option for $420. To my surprise, the seller happened to live just a short 10-minute drive away from my place. We agreed to meet, and he agreed to sell me his supposedly pristine Rogers Samsung S5 for $400. Considering myself somewhat tech-savvy, I was well aware of the existence of fake replicas and blacklisted IMEI numbers. Determined to avoid any potential scams, I took the necessary precautions and requested the seller to send me the IMEI number via text message. The IMEI checked out clean, and everything appeared to be in order. On the designated day, at 4:30 p.m., we met in the West Island of Montreal. The seller, a 17-year-old boy sporting a red t-shirt, arrived on his yellow bicycle. He seemed polite and respectful, leaving a favorable impression. I carefully examined the phone, verifying that everything looked brand new, including the matching IMEI numbers on both the phone and the box. The presence of the Rogers bloatware further reinforced my belief that the transaction was legitimate. Without hesitation, I inserted my SIM card, and to my delight, everything worked flawlessly. I had no reason to doubt the authenticity of the phone. However, my optimism quickly faded when I reached home and performed a factory reset on the device, only to be greeted with an invalid IMEI message. My subsequent online research revealed that the seller had rooted the phone and manipulated the user interface to display a falsified IMEI number that matched the one on the box. In essence, he had sold me a counterfeit Samsung S5, lacking the fingerprint sensor feature which I foolishly neglected to verify. Although the box and accessories were genuine, the phone itself was a mere imitation. That very night, I attempted to contact the seller regarding the issue, but he proved uncooperative. After exchanging a few messages, he finally relented and agreed to refund my money the following morning at 8:30 a.m. at the same location where we had initially met. Later that night, I took it upon myself to investigate the seller further. I discovered that he had deleted his Kijiji ad and had employed an online forwarding service for his phone number. To gather more information, I turned to Google Street View and scoured the residential areas surrounding our meeting spot, and there it was evidence of the same young man on his bike, entering a house. I had caught him red-handed. The next morning, I arrived at the agreed-upon location, fully expecting to retrieve my money as promised. However, my expectations were dashed as the seller was a no-show. He had bailed at the last minute and ignored my calls. Frustrated but undeterred, I decided to drive around the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or uncover any leads. Alas, my efforts proved futile, and I left empty-handed. Nevertheless, I refused to give up. Fast forward 1 week to Sunday, August 17, 2014. I revisited the same area, and lo and behold, I spotted a car parked in front of the aforementioned house. Maintaining a safe distance, I patiently observed the situation. After 15 minutes, I saw the culprit, carrying grocery bags, making his way back to his house. Seizing the moment, I swiftly exited my car and confronted him. He was taken aback by my presence, but managed to maintain his composure. Though I refrained from physical altercations, I shadowed him closely, presenting him with two options: Either he returned my money, allowing us to part ways, or I would involve the police and report his illicit activities. Sadly, the scammer remained indifferent and showed no inclination to rectify the situation. Unfazed, I continued to tail him as he boarded a public bus, likely assuming that he could elude me, believing I wouldn't follow him any further. However, I remained steadfast and joined him on the bus. 5 minutes into the ride, a police van intercepted the bus, bringing it to a halt. The officers entered, and I pointed them in the direction of the culprit. Eventually, justice prevailed, and I managed to reclaim my money, his best course of action given the circumstances. As for the scammer, he faced the consequences of his actions, getting arrested for possession of stolen goods, as the personal phone he carried was reported as stolen. Reflecting on the incident, I consider myself fortunate to have identified the perpetrator thanks to the assistance of Google Street View. This experience serves as a reminder to stay vigilant and exercise caution when conducting transactions. Story 3. When I was at university, I started dating this guy. At first, he was wonderful, dedicated to his studies, fun to be around, attentive, always surprising me with things, and working hard at his job. Then, bit by bit, things started to unravel. He began skipping classes, and eventually, he barely attended at all. Worse still, he never helped around the house. He didn't wash up, clean, or do laundry, nothing. He was even fired from his job due to too many no-shows. All he wanted to do was sit at home, play video games, or browse message boards and forums. This was in the days before social media, when things were quite different. This left me having to pick up extra shifts, sometimes double and triple, while still attending classes and studying. I later learned that this behavior was a pattern for him. He'd initially dedicate himself to whatever he was focused on, but then he'd get bored and fall back into old, bad habits. Then, he'd find a new passion and repeat the cycle. I knew I should have ended the relationship much sooner, but I held out hope that he would snap out of it. I thought maybe it was just the stress from exams. I desperately wanted things to go back to how they were. But it wasn't meant to be. I eventually caught him cheating and threw him out. I was so overwhelmed with everything going on that it wasn't until the next day that I remembered our joint savings account. There was a little over £5,000 in there, and aside from a few £100s from him, the rest was money I had saved. When I checked the account, it was all gone. My ex had cleaned out the account and moved into a new flat with his new girlfriend. I called the bank, but there was nothing they could do since he was authorized on the account. I contacted the police, but they also said there was nothing they could do since it was a joint account, meaning nothing criminal had happened. They suggested I take it to civil court, but they warned that I'd likely spend more money in legal fees than I'd get back, so it wasn't worth pursuing. My ex had essentially stolen £5,000, and there was nothing I could do about it. I felt like such a fool. I became even angrier when I saw his posts on various forums, boasting about his new game consoles, television, and gadgets all purchased with my money. I'm not usually someone who seeks revenge. I can be petty on occasion, sure, but I had never wanted to exact payback as much as I did right then, and I knew exactly how to do it. While I was a student, I worked summer jobs to help pay for my studies. One of those jobs was at a debt collection agency. The work was as unpleasant as you might imagine, but it paid well, and it was only for a few months. My ex had been dodging his debts for years, and he was quite proud of that fact. He was also proud that his debt was close to being written off by law, meaning that the creditors would no longer be able to enforce payment. In the United Kingdom, creditors have about 6 years to collect a debt, and if they don't, it becomes legally unenforceable. However, what many people don't realize is that making any payment on that debt resets the clock. If you pay any amount, even a small one, the 6-year period starts over again. Previously, I had used my insider knowledge to help him avoid his debts. Now, I would use it to hit him where it hurt. By the end of our relationship, I was handling everything, including his debts. I had all the paperwork, so I knew who he owed and how much. I called his creditors and told them I was a friend making a payment on his behalf. I didn't pretend to be him, that would have been illegal. The creditors weren't allowed to disclose any details to me, but they could take payment. I paid the minimum amount possible on each debt, about £1 on most. Although one had a minimum payment of £1.50, it was the best £8.50 I ever spent. I also made sure to give them his new address and contact details, as well as his parents' address. Having worked in the industry, I knew they wouldn't change the address without his authorization, but they would note it. They had systems in place to search for his name at that address and update their records if they found a match. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait. A few months passed, and then it happened. His posts on the forums went from bragging about his new gaming computer to panicking about an upcoming court date. He called me, begging for advice. I told him to leave me alone. When he realized I wouldn't help, he turned to his online friends for advice. One of them suggested not showing up to court, claiming that the authorities couldn't take action if he wasn't there. It was terrible advice and completely untrue. In fact, not showing up to court is one of the worst things you can do, especially in a civil case. Things were starting to look better and better for me. The court date came and went, and naturally, my ex didn't attend. A few weeks later, he posted pictures of his empty flat. The bailiffs had come and taken every last one of his shiny new gadgets and toys. On top of that, he ended up with several court judgments against him. These judgments are a serious issue and can significantly damage your credit history. They make it difficult to get anything beyond a basic bank account, nearly impossible to get credit including mortgages, and they can even make it hard to rent a place since many landlords don't want to rent to someone with bad credit. He also wouldn't be able to find work in the financial sector. With all of his belongings gone and his financial situation ruined, his new girlfriend left him. I never got my £5,000 back, but it felt incredibly satisfying to see everything he had bought with my money taken away. I hope that £5,000 was worth it for him. For anyone wondering how a student accumulated 6 years of debt, he had started at my university when he was 25. He had initially gone to a different university at 18, but dropped out at 19 to work. Later, he convinced his parents to fund a business degree because he wanted to become an entrepreneur. And for those concerned about the age gap between us, I had deferred my university start date by a few years so I could travel. I was 22 when we started dating, and he was 26. Story 4. I'm a freelance graphic designer, and I was working on a big project at my favorite coffee shop. It's usually a quiet place, perfect for getting work done. But not today. I was deep into my work, headphones on, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked up to see a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, staring at me with wide eyes. The kid asked if he could play games on my laptop. I politely declined, explaining that I was working and couldn't let him use my computer. The kid frowned and walked away. I thought that was the end of it, but boy, was I wrong. A few minutes later, I felt another tap. It was the same kid, but this time he had a woman with him. She had that, "I want to speak to the manager" haircut and a scowl that could curdle milk. The woman demanded to know why I wouldn't let her son use my laptop. I explained that I was working and that this was my work computer, which I couldn't let anyone else use. She insisted it would only be for a few minutes, accusing me of being selfish because her son was bored. I apologized but stood firm, telling her I had deadlines to meet. I turned back to my work, hoping they'd leave me alone. But then, without warning, the kid leaned in close to my ear and let out an ear-piercing scream. I jumped, nearly knocking over my coffee. I exclaimed in shock and anger at the sudden noise. The woman immediately got defensive, warning me not to speak to her son like that. I pointed out that her son had just screamed in my ear and told her to control her kid. That's when things went from bad to worse. The woman's face turned red, and before I knew it, her hand connected with my cheek. The slap echoed through the coffee shop, and everyone turned to look. I asked her in disbelief if she had just slapped me. She retorted that I deserved it for yelling at her precious boy. I stood up, my cheeks stinging and my blood boiling. I'd had enough of this entitled behavior. I informed her that her precious boy had just assaulted me by screaming in my ear, and now she had assaulted me too. I told her I was calling the police. She tried to call my bluff, saying I wouldn't dare. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. That's when she lunged at me, trying to grab my phone. I stepped back, and she lost her balance, falling forward. As she fell, I instinctively moved to the side, and she ended up hitting the edge of my table with her hip. She went down hard, landing on her backside. The woman cried out in pain, claiming I had pushed her and injured her hip and back. I denied touching her, explaining that she had tried to attack me and fell. By this time, the coffee shop manager had come over and asked what was going on. I explained the situation, and thankfully, several other customers backed up my story. The manager asked the woman and her son to leave, but she refused, claiming she was injured and couldn't walk. The manager offered to call an ambulance if she was injured, but insisted she needed to leave the premises. The woman threatened to sue, claiming it was all my fault. I calmly pointed out that there were security cameras that likely caught everything. The woman's face paled at the mention of cameras. She suddenly found the strength to stand up, albeit a bit wobbly. She told her son they were leaving this awful place, and as they left, I could hear her muttering about lawsuits and injustice. The manager apologized to me and offered a free coffee. I accepted gratefully, my hands still shaking a bit from the adrenaline. I spent the next hour giving a statement to the police, who had been called by another customer. They took the security footage and statements from witnesses. They informed me that the woman could be charged with assault. As I packed up my things to leave, still a bit rattled, an older gentleman approached me. He commended me on handling the situation well and encouraged me not to let people like that push me around. Story 5. Backstory. I rented a room in a 2-ish bedroom apartment while I was at university. I rented from the current tenant who was living in the living room, which had been turned into a bedroom. Her story was that she had rented the place with her friend who had the official bedroom, but had moved out after finishing her degree. At the time, I was desperate for a place. I was living on an acquaintance's sofa for a month, while trying to find my own place, so I was probably a bit more trusting than I should have been. In my defense, the contract I signed had the letterhead of the building on it, so I assumed it was legit. I figured out there was something wrong though after about a month when she told me that she was going away for a week, and to not bother the people in the reception office and do not collect any packages that arrive in that time. Up to that point, she had always picked up the mail and any packages that were delivered by the time I had returned from classes, so I never had a reason to go fetch anything before. This was the first inkling I had that there was an issue. I ignored her BTW and never had any issues. The front desk staff and the maintenance guys knew me and liked me well enough so they never caused trouble or asked too many questions. The mailroom lady even said she preferred when I picked up the mail because I was polite, unlike the woman I live with. Fast forward a year and things started to get strange. My roomie was a party girl that would keep strange hours and was trying to get herself set up in her dream job. She managed to get herself hired, but they needed a copy of her working visa. Pin drop. Turned out she had come to the country as a student on a student visa and overstayed by several years. Up to that point, all of her employment had been under the table, cash in hand sort of gigs, and she had a line of sugar daddies as long as the Nile River, so she never had to prove working rights. This is where it really started to hit the fan. A letter arrived from the Department of Immigration. It was a notice of deportation. The potential employer had reported her when she couldn't provide a valid visa. She freaked and got a lawyer who told her to go back to her home country and apply for a working visa from there. She thought it would all be okay, so she left everything she owned, minus 3 suitcases worth of stuff, and went home for a vacation. Before leaving, she told me that she was going to rent her half of the apartment, so she didn't have to pay rent, and got upset when I raised concerns about a stranger moving in. Keep in mind that I had gone home for 3 months and had to still pay rent because she refused to let me sublet because it made her uncomfortable. We argued because I wanted to at least meet the person who would live with me, and the roomie got all pissed, but begrudgingly agreed to let me meet them. I was also concerned because by this stage, I had confronted her about the fact that she was illegally subletting to me and didn't want some other poor girl in this situation too. Anyways, she left the country and I had the place to myself for a month before a short-term replacement moved in. She was a nice girl who just needed a place for 1 month, while she was in town for work, which suited Rumi just fine because she thought she would be back by then. 3 weeks after the new girl moved in, the roomie called freaking out because her application for a visa was denied, and she was banned for several years for overstaying. She said the lawyer was contesting it, but it would be a few months, so she would place another ad for a replacement sublet once the current one moved out in a week. Oh, joy. Whatever, I was wrapped up with school, and the place was finally not a flophouse for party animals. The new tenant is found. A 3-month rental was settled on because she was only in town as an exchange student for 1 term. Around this time, I decided to move in with my then boyfriend as we were getting engaged. As per my lease, I gave Rumi just over a month's notice. She freaked. First, she demanded that I pay her an additional month's rent, on top of the last month's rent that was already paid when I moved in. Because I was causing her trouble, I said no. Then she told me that I had to be out in 2 weeks, so she could rent the place faster. I told her that wasn't possible because I was in the middle of finals and she would just have to deal. This is where she went off the rails. She started threatening me. She threatened that her guy friend would come to beat me up, threatened that she would have someone who had a spare key come over and throw me and my stuff out. I blocked her and started frantically trying to get my stuff moved out. While all this was going on, Rumi started threatening and harassing the temp girl to try and get her to force me to pay more rent money and to get out sooner. Now on to the revenge. The temp girl and I discussed what was happening. Rumi had told her to tell me that she was going to call the building and have me thrown out for trespassing. I decided to call her bluff and went to the building manager, explained everything and asked how long I had to get my stuff out. They already knew I was an illegal sublet and didn't really care as long as things were civil and on the down low. But this changed everything. Manager asked for a copy of my lease and a letter from me telling them all that had happened, including how I came to rent the place, why there had been other sublets, the whole story. Temp girl also provided a letter as she had decided to move out too. This is where it gets even better. Temp tells Rumi that she will be leaving as well due to a change of plans. This is fine with Rumi as she has made arrangements for one of her other friends to take over the lease temporarily. So Rumi sends a guy friend around the night before Temp is to move out to inspect the place to make sure it's clean. He gets there and has no idea what has happened or what sort of show he walked into. First, he FaceTime her and she goes ballistic that all my furniture is gone. It was my stuff, I bought it in. But she thought since I was moving in with a guy that I would leave it all for the next tenant. Never did figure out why other than she was probably hoping to advertise it as a furnished room. Then she tells Temp she wants her out immediately, that night. Keep in mind, it's also almost midnight at this point and Temp has no place to go. She then tells her guy friend to repay Temp the last month of rent, since that is what they agreed to. This guy was not told this prior, and he had to fork over nearly $1,000 in cash from his own pocket. So this guy says he has to go get the cash and will be right back. He hangs up and leaves while Temp comes over to the neighbor's place where I'm waiting in case she needs help. We were friends with the neighbor and tells me what happened. Guy friend gets back and we all go out to meet him. He is a nice guy and feels like a jerk if he kicks a woman out on the street in the middle of the night. So he says he will let her sleep the night there and will just come back in the morning before work to lock the place up. I think he was also pissed at the surprises that were sprung on him that night too. The final revenge came about 2 weeks later when the owners canceled the lease and sent a notice of eviction. Rumi had 1 week to move out, and since she was in another country, she had to try and organize it all from there. I spent time hanging out with the neighbor who I had made friends with, and no one ever came to clean the place out. After the eviction deadline, maintenance came in and changed the locks and cleared the place out. There was over $3,000 worth of furniture, and God knows how much designer clothing, shoes, and bags that were just left there. I found out later, through a mutual acquaintance, that Rumi had started crying to all her friends that it was all my fault, and that I got her kicked out and deported and cost her all this money so she had nothing to pay anyone with to store her stuff and ship it back to her home country. Basically, she tried to get her friends to not only clean the place out, but ship all of it to her. Story 6. I never thought I'd end up on Entitled People, but that's exactly where my story belongs. It all started on a Saturday afternoon when I decided to run some errands at my local grocery store. As I was walking towards the entrance, I noticed a group of veterans selling poppies to raise money for their association. I felt a sudden urge to help them, so I reached into my pocket and pulled out some cash. Little did I know that my good deed would end up with me being shoved by a woman that we'll refer to with Karen. But before I dive into the details of that incident, let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Emily, and I'm a 27-year-old social worker. I've always been passionate about helping others, which is why I chose this career path. I've worked with children, the elderly, and even the homeless. I believe that everyone deserves a chance to live a decent life, and I try my best to make that happen. On that fateful day, I had just finished volunteering at a local animal shelter when I decided to stop by the grocery store. I was wearing my usual attire, a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and my favorite sneakers. I had my hair tied up in a messy bun, and I was carrying a canvas bag that read, "Adopt, don't shop." I must have looked like a hot mess, but I didn't care. I was on a mission to get some groceries and help the veterans. As soon as I saw the veterans, I walked towards them with a smile on my face. "Hi there, I'd like to make a donation," I said as I handed them some cash. "Thank you so much, miss. Your generosity means a lot to us," one of the veterans said. "No problem at all. Thank you for your service," I replied. I continued walking towards the store, feeling proud of myself for doing a good deed. That's when I heard someone yelling behind me. I turned around and saw Karen, a middle-aged woman with short hair and an angry expression on her face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shouted. "I'm sorry," I replied, confused. "You can't just give money to those people. They're probably scammers. You're just encouraging them," she continued to yell. "They're veterans raising money for their association," I explained calmly. "I don't care. You're just wasting your money. You should give it to people who actually deserve it," she replied, getting closer to me. At that point, I realized that Karen was one of those entitled people that I had heard so much about. I tried to walk away, but she shoved me hard, causing me to lose my balance and drop my canvas bag. "What the hell?" I exclaimed, feeling both angry and embarrassed. "You're the one who should be ashamed of yourself. Giving money to those scammers, you should be ashamed of yourself," Karen continued to yell. That's when a security guard intervened. "Ma'am, please calm down. You can't just shove people like that," he said. "She started it. She's the one who's giving money to those scammers," Karen replied. "That's not true, ma'am. These people are legitimate veterans raising money for their association. And even if they weren't, you can't just shove people like that," the security guard explained. Karen tried to argue some more, but the security guard ended up cuffing her and taking her away. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had never been physically attacked like that before, and it was all because I had tried to do something good. After the incident, I went into the grocery store and tried to calm myself down. I walked up and down the aisles, picking up the items on my grocery list, but I couldn't shake off the anger and sadness I felt. Why was it so hard for some people to understand the importance of giving back to those who have served our country? Why did Karen feel entitled to physically attack me for trying to help others? As I was waiting in line to check out, a woman tapped me on the shoulder. "Excuse me, I just wanted to say that I saw what happened outside, and I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said. "Thank you, that's very kind of you," I replied. "I'm a veteran myself, and it's people like you who make a difference. Don't let people like that Karen discourage you from doing good," she continued. I smiled at her and thanked her for her service. Her words made me feel a little bit better, and I realized that I couldn't let one entitled person ruin my faith in humanity. I was still going to do good, no matter what. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I decided to write a post on social media about my experience, hoping to raise awareness about entitlement and the importance of giving back. To my surprise, my post went viral, and I received hundreds of messages of support from people all over the world. A few days later, I received a message from a woman who worked at a local charity organization. She had seen my post and was impressed by my passion for helping others. She invited me to volunteer at their upcoming fundraiser, which was going to benefit homeless veterans in our area. I jumped at the opportunity, and the fundraiser ended up being a huge success. We raised thousands of dollars for the veterans, and I met so many amazing people who shared my passion for giving back. Looking back on that day at the grocery store, I realized that Karen's entitlement had actually led me to an incredible opportunity. If she hadn't shoved me, I wouldn't have written that post, and I wouldn't have been invited to volunteer at the fundraiser. It's funny how life works sometimes. In the end, I learned that even when faced with entitled people, it's important to stay true to your values and continue doing good. There will always be people like Karen in the world, but there are also people who appreciate and support kindness and generosity. And that's what really matters.